It is the morning of March 17th, 1892. The ground is frozen solid, covered in a thin layer of snow that crunches under the boots of the men walking through Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. The sky is grey, heavy with the promise of more winter, even though spring should be arriving soon. A crowd has gathered. There are perhaps 30 or 40 people standing among the gravestones. Farmers, mostly. Men with rough hands and weathered faces, dressed in their Sunday best, even though this is a Thursday. Their wives stand with them, shawls pulled tight against the cold. Everyone is quiet. The usual sounds of a New England morning, birds, wind in the trees, the distant sounds of farm animals seem muted, as if nature itself is holding its breath. In the center of the crowd stands a man named George Brown. He is 54 years old, but he looks older, much older. His face is deeply lined, his shoulders slumped under a weight that has nothing to do with the cold. He has buried his wife, he has buried 2 of his daughters, and now his only son is dying in a bed at home, coughing up blood, wasting away to nothing. George Brown is here to dig them up. 3 graves, 3 members of his family. Because his neighbors, good Christian people who have known him all his life, have told him that one of his dead loved ones is a vampire. That even in death, one of them is feeding on his son's life, draining him slowly from beyond the grave. And there is only one way to stop it. The men with shovels step forward. The frozen earth resists, but they are strong and they are determined. The sound of metal biting into soil echoes across the cemetery, and George Brown watches, his face an unreadable mask, as they begin to open the graves. The first grave belongs to his wife, Mary Eliza. She's been dead for 9 years. When they reach her coffin and pry it open, they find exactly what they expected. Bones, fragments of cloth, the natural work of time and decay. She is at rest. She is not the vampire. The second grave belongs to his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, dead for 4 years. Again, the coffin is opened. Again, they find what they expect. Advanced decomposition, a body returning to the earth. She, too, is at rest. The third grave belongs to his youngest daughter, Mercy Lena Brown. She has been dead for only 2 months. She was 19 years old when tuberculosis took her in January. 19 years old, with dark hair and a quick smile, a girl who sang in the church choir and loved her family and had her whole life ahead of her. The men lift her coffin out of the frozen ground and set it on the snow. George Brown does not look away. He cannot look away. His hands are trembling, but not from the cold. They open the coffin, and what they find inside changes everything. Mercy's body has not decayed. Her flesh is still intact. Her face, though pale and waxy, is still recognizable. When they examine her more closely, and this part is difficult to speak of, but it happened, they cut open her chest and find that her heart still contains liquid blood, not dried, not clotted, but liquid. And when they shift her body slightly, some of that blood spills out, dark and wet on the white snow. The crowd gasps. Some of the women cry out. The men look at each other with expressions that mix horror and grim satisfaction. This is it. This is the proof they needed. Mercy Brown, the sweet girl who sang in the choir, is the vampire. Dr. Harold Metcalf is present, a real physician, a man of science and learning. He examines the body and confirms what everyone can see with their own eyes. There is liquid blood in her heart. Her body has not decomposed as it should have. To the people of 1892, these are not medical anomalies or the natural result of a body buried in frozen ground during the coldest part of winter. These are the signs of the undead. And so, right there in the cemetery, surrounded by the graves of the good Christian people of Exeter, Rhode Island, they perform a ritual that is older than Christianity itself. They remove Mercy's heart and liver. They build a fire on a large rock, and they burn her organs to ash, the smoke rising into the grey sky like a terrible prayer. They collect the ashes, mix them with water, and carry the mixture back to the Brown farmhouse, where Edwin, George's son, Mercy's brother, is lying in bed, so weak he can barely lift his head. They give him the ashes of his sister's heart to drink. This is not a story from medieval Europe. This is not a legend from some dark, superstitious past. This happened in America, in Rhode Island, in 1892, just 3 years before the first movie was ever made, the same year Ellis Island opened, a time when electric lights were spreading through cities and the modern world was being born. How does this happen? How does a community of educated, religious, modern Americans come to believe in vampires? How does a father allow his daughter's body to be desecrated in this way? Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these forgotten chapters of American history deserve to be remembered, if you believe we learn by understanding our past, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. Tonight, we will journey back to that small Rhode Island town. We will meet the Brown family before tragedy struck. We will witness the slow, horrifying progression of the disease that tore them apart. We will understand the ancient fear that turned neighbors into grave robbers. And we will stand at Mercy Brown's grave today and ask ourselves, was she a victim twice, once of disease and once of fear? This is not just a vampire story. This is a story about tuberculosis, the white plague that killed millions. It is a story about what happens when we don't understand the world around us, when science fails us, and we turn to older, darker beliefs. It is a story about love and desperation, and the terrible things we do when we're trying to save the people we love. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Before we can understand what happened to Mercy Brown and her family, we must first understand the monster that killed them. But this monster was not a creature of folklore. It was not a vampire or a demon or a curse. It was a disease. And in the 1800s, it was the most feared killer in the entire world. We know it today as tuberculosis or TB, but in Mercy Brown's time, they called it by a different name. They called it consumption. And that name tells you everything you need to know about what this disease did to people. It consumed them. Imagine a disease that starts so quietly, you barely notice it. Maybe you're just a little more tired than usual. Maybe you have a slight cough that won't go away. You tell yourself it's nothing, just a cold, just the changing seasons. You keep working, keep living your life, but the cough doesn't stop. It gets worse, deeper. And then one morning, you cough into your handkerchief and see a small spot of blood, just a little bit. You tell yourself it's from coughing too hard, that you must have irritated your throat. But the blood keeps coming, more and more. Your body begins to waste away. No matter how much you eat, you lose weight. Your skin becomes pale, almost translucent. Your eyes sink back into your skull. Your cheeks hollow out. You develop a fever that comes and goes, soaking your nightclothes with sweat. And the cough, always the cough. A wet, rattling sound that everyone in the house can hear, even through closed doors. A sound that brings up more and more blood, until sometimes you feel like you're drowning in it. This is what consumption did. It took months, sometimes years, but it hollowed you out from the inside. It ate away at your lungs until you couldn't breathe without pain. It drained the life from you so slowly that people could watch you fade, day by day, week by week, until finally there was nothing left but a pale, skeletal ghost of the person you used to be. And then you died. In the 1800s, tuberculosis killed 1 out of every 7 people who ever lived. Read that again. 1 in 7. It was the single greatest cause of death in the world. It killed more people than war, more than childbirth, more than any other disease. It killed the young and the old, the rich and the poor. It killed poets and farmers, presidents and paupers. And no one knew how to stop it. Here is what made consumption so terrifying to the people of the 1800s. It seemed to run in families, but no one understood why. A mother would fall ill and die. Then, a few months or a year later, one of her children would develop the same cough, the same wasting away. Then another child, then another. It was as if the disease were hunting, moving from person to person within a household, selecting its victims one by one. People in the 1800s did not understand germs. They did not know about bacteria or viruses. They did not know that tuberculosis was caused by a tiny organism called Mycobacterium tuberculosis that spread through the air when an infected person coughed or breathed. They did not know that living in close quarters with a sick person meant you were breathing in those bacteria with every breath. All they knew was that when one person in a family got consumption, others would follow. It looked like a curse. It looked like something was passing from the dead to the living, some invisible force that was draining the life from each family member in turn. And there was another strange thing. The disease seemed to have a personality. It was different for different people. Some people died quickly, within months. Others lingered for years, having good days and bad days, seeming to recover and then relapsing. Some people exposed to the disease never got sick at all. This randomness, this unpredictability, made it even more frightening. You couldn't protect yourself. You couldn't run from it. If consumption wanted you, it would find you. And if it wanted your family, it would take you one by one, with a patience that seemed almost cruel. There was a strange contradiction in how people thought about consumption in the 1800s. On one hand, they feared it desperately. On the other hand, they romanticized it. Writers and poets described consumptive young women as tragic and beautiful. They wrote about how the disease made them look ethereal, otherworldly, with pale skin and bright, feverish eyes. They wrote about how consumption seemed to refine people, to make them more spiritual, more sensitive, more artistic. This was, of course, complete nonsense, a cruel lie that made suffering seem beautiful. The reality of consumption was not romantic. It was blood and sweat and the smell of sickness. It was watching someone you loved waste away, becoming thinner and weaker and more desperate with each passing day. It was the wet, rattling cough that kept everyone in the house awake at night. It was the knowledge that nothing you did would help, that all you could do was watch and wait for the inevitable end. But the romantic myth persisted, because people needed to find some meaning in all that suffering. If consumption made people beautiful, if it refined their souls, if it made them more like angels before they died, well, at least their death meant something. At least there was a purpose to the pain. It was a lie people told themselves to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. In the early 1880s, the Brown family lived on a small farm in Exeter, Rhode Island. Exeter was, and still is, a tiny rural town. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where families have lived on the same land for generations, where life moves at the slow, steady pace of the farming seasons. George Brown was the head of the household. He was a farmer, like his father before him and his grandfather before that. He worked the land with his own hands, planting in the spring, harvesting in the fall, caring for animals, repairing fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that keep a farm running. He was not rich, but he was respectable. He was known as an honest man, a good neighbor, a devoted husband and father. His wife was Mary Eliza Brown. She was the heart of the household, the one who kept everything running smoothly. She cooked and cleaned and sewed and tended the vegetable garden. She raised the children with a firm hand and a warm heart. She sang hymns while she worked, and her voice was said to be lovely. They had 4 children. Mary Olive was the eldest, a serious girl who helped her mother with the household chores and was expected to marry well. Mercy Lena was younger, more spirited, with a quick laugh and a love of singing. She had inherited her mother's voice, and she sang in the church choir every Sunday. Edwin was the only son, the boy who would inherit the farm and carry on the Brown name. And there was one more child, whose name has been lost to history, who survived and lived a full life away from the shadow of this tragedy. This was a normal family, a good family. They went to church on Sundays at the Baptist church in the center of town. They worked hard and were kind to their neighbors. They had hopes and dreams for the future. They had no reason to believe that within a decade, most of them would be dead. And then, in 1883, Mary Eliza started to cough. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a cold, maybe, or a touch of winter illness. Mary Eliza kept working, kept running the household, even as the cough persisted. But George noticed that she was getting tired more easily, that she was losing weight, even though she was eating normally. By spring, there was blood in her handkerchief. The family called for the doctor. In rural Rhode Island in the 1880s, medical care was limited. The doctor came, examined Mary Eliza, listened to her lungs, and delivered the diagnosis that everyone dreaded. Consumption. There was no cure. The doctor could offer only palliative care, rest, fresh air, nutritious food. People said that moving to a drier climate might help, but the Browns were farmers. They couldn't just pack up and move to Colorado or Arizona. The farm was their life, their livelihood. They had to stay. And so, Mary Eliza got sicker. The children watched their mother fade. They watched her become thinner, more fragile, until she seemed barely there at all. They heard her coughing at night, terrible, racking coughs that shook her whole body. They saw the blood, more and more of it. George did everything he could. He hired a woman from town to help with the housework so Mary Eliza could rest. He bought the best food they could afford. He sat with her in the evenings, holding her hand, telling her stories, pretending that everything would be all right. But they both knew it wouldn't be. In December of 1883, Mary Eliza Brown died. She was buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, in a grave marked with a simple stone. George and the children stood in the cold, listening to the pastor read from the Bible, watching as the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground. The family grieved, but they also tried to move forward. Death was common in the 1880s, especially in farming communities. You mourned, and then you kept living. George had a farm to run and children to raise. Life went on. They had no idea that this was just the beginning. For the next few years, the Brown family tried to rebuild their lives. George learned to manage the household without his wife. The children grew older and took on more responsibilities. Mary Olive, as the eldest daughter, stepped into her mother's role, cooking and cleaning and caring for her younger siblings. Life was hard, but it was manageable. The farm kept producing. The children stayed healthy. George allowed himself to hope that the worst was behind them, that the loss of Mary Eliza was a terrible tragedy, but an isolated one. And then, in 1888, 5 years after her mother's death, Mary Olive started to cough. When Mary Olive developed the first symptoms of consumption, George Brown must have felt like he was living through a nightmare for the second time. Not again. Please, God, not again. But it was happening. The same progression, the same slow, inevitable decline. Mary Olive, who was 20 years old and should have been looking forward to marriage and a family of her own, was now spending her days in bed, too weak to work, coughing blood into rags that had to be burned because no amount of washing could get them clean. The family tried everything. They called the doctor again, but he had no more answers than he'd had 5 years earlier. They tried patent medicines, expensive tonics, advertised in newspapers that promised miraculous cures. They tried home remedies passed down through generations, teas made from herbs, poultices applied to the chest, prayers and Bible verses written on slips of paper and tucked under the pillow. Nothing worked. Mary Olive died in 1888 at the age of 20. She was buried next to her mother in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. And now the whispers began. In a small town like Exeter, everyone knows everyone's business. And everyone had noticed that George Brown had now lost his wife and his eldest daughter to the same disease. They had noticed that both times the progression was the same. The cough, the wasting away, the blood, the death. People began to talk. Not openly, not at first, but in quiet conversations after church, in hushed words at the general store, in whispers shared between neighbors over garden fences. It's strange, isn't it? Both of them the same way. My grandmother used to say that consumption runs in families differently, that sometimes the dead don't rest easy. There are stories, old stories, about what you're supposed to do when this happens. These were educated people. This was 1888, not the Dark Ages. Most of them could read and write. They read newspapers from Providence and Boston. They knew about the modern world, about inventions and progress and science. But they also remembered the old stories, the stories their grandparents had told them, brought over from Europe generations ago. Stories about the undead, about the dead who weren't quite dead, about what happened when consumption moved through a family like a predator stalking prey. They didn't use the word vampire. Not yet. That was too dramatic, too foreign, too much like a fairy tale. But they talked about the wasting disease, and about unnatural deaths, and about old remedies that people used to use, back before modern medicine, back when people knew how to deal with these things. George Brown heard the whispers, and he ignored them. He was a modern man. He didn't believe in superstition. He believed in science, in progress, in the rational world. His wife and daughter had died of a disease. A terrible disease, yes. A painful disease, but a natural one. There was nothing supernatural about it. He focused on his remaining children, on Mercy, who was healthy and strong and beautiful, on Edwin, his only son, who would inherit the farm someday, on keeping his family together and moving forward. But the universe was not done with George Brown. Mercy Lena Brown was born in 1873. She was the middle child, sandwiched between her older sister Mary Olive and her younger brother Edwin. While Mary Olive was serious and responsible, Mercy was joyful. She had a quick smile and an easy laugh. She loved to sing, just like her mother had, and her voice was so beautiful that she was invited to sing solos in the church choir. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that Victorian society valued. We have no photographs of her. The Brown family could not afford such luxuries, but the descriptions we have say she was small, slender, with dark hair and lively eyes. She had a warmth about her, a presence that made people feel comfortable. Mercy helped on the farm, doing the household chores that were expected of women in that time. She cooked and cleaned and tended the garden. But she also had dreams. She talked about maybe becoming a teacher someday, or about marrying and having children of her own. She was 19 years old in 1891. Her whole life was ahead of her. And then, in the autumn of 1891, Mercy started to feel tired. Tuberculosis is a strange disease. Sometimes it moves slowly, taking years to kill. Sometimes it moves like lightning. For Mercy, it was the latter. In October, she felt a little run down. By November, she had developed a cough. By December, she was bedridden. And by January of 1892, she was dead. It's happened so fast that the family barely had time to process it. 1 month she was singing in the choir. 3 months later, she was in a coffin. The speed of her decline was almost merciful in its way. She didn't suffer for years like her mother and sister had. But it was also shocking. Mercy had always been healthy. She had shown no signs of weakness. And then, suddenly, she was gone. On January 17th, 1892, Mercy Lena Brown died. She was 19 years old. George Brown had now buried his wife, his eldest daughter, and his youngest daughter. 3 coffins, 3 graves in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, all in a row. And as he stood in the frozen cemetery, watching Mercy's coffin being lowered into the ground, he did not know that in just 2 months, he would be standing in this same spot, watching as that coffin was dug back up. Edwin Brown was George's only son. He was in his early 20s, a young man who should have been full of health and vigor. But Edwin had shown signs of consumption several years earlier, and like many tuberculosis patients of that era, he had been sent west. Colorado Springs, Colorado, was famous in the late 1800s as a destination for people with tuberculosis. The air there was dry and thin, and doctors believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that this climate could cure consumption. Entire towns in Colorado were built around tuberculosis sanatoriums, hospitals where the sick went to recover, or, more often, to die. Edwin had been in Colorado for some time, trying to get better. When news reached him that his sister Mercy had died, he came home for the funeral, and George could see immediately that his son was not cured. He was worse. Edwin was terribly thin. His skin was pale and waxy. His eyes were sunken, and he had the cough, that terrible, familiar cough that George had heard from his wife, from Mary Olive, from Mercy. After the funeral, Edwin was too weak to make the journey back to Colorado. He stayed in the farmhouse, in his childhood room, and his condition continued to deteriorate. By March, Edwin was dying. George Brown sat with his son day after day, watching him fade, watching him cough up blood, watching him become thinner and weaker. And George knew with absolute certainty that he was about to lose his last child. 4 members of his immediate family dead from consumption within 9 years. An entire household wiped out by disease. George Brown was not a religious fanatic. He was not prone to superstition. But even the most rational man, when faced with this kind of unrelenting tragedy, begins to wonder, why is this happening to me? Try to imagine what George Brown was thinking in those dark days of March 1892. His wife, dead. His eldest daughter, dead. His youngest daughter, dead. His only son, dying. Soon, he would be alone. The Brown family line would end. The farm would be sold to strangers. Every person he had loved would be in the ground, and he would be left behind, a broken old man with nothing but grief and memories. This couldn't just be bad luck. This couldn't be a simple matter of a contagious disease running through his household. The numbers didn't make sense. Consumption killed 1 in 7 people, yes, but it didn't usually kill everyone in one family. Other families in Exeter had cases of consumption, but they didn't lose 4 people in less than a decade. Why his family? What had they done to deserve this? What cosmic injustice was at work? And more importantly, was there anything he could do to stop it? Medical science had failed him. Every doctor he'd consulted had told him the same thing. There was no cure. Rest, fresh air, good food. These things might help, but they were no guarantee. Edwin had gone all the way to Colorado, to the best climate for consumption patients, and he was still dying. Modern medicine had nothing left to offer George Brown. But there was something else, something older, something that his neighbors kept mentioning, carefully, delicately, in those whispered conversations. The old cure, the old way. The neighbors came to George Brown's farm on a cold evening in early March. There were several of them, men he'd known all his life, good Christian men who went to church every Sunday and worked hard and raised their families. They sat in his parlor and they spoke carefully, aware that what they were suggesting was almost unthinkable. "George," one of them said, "we've been talking. We've been watching what's happened to your family. And we think we know what's wrong." George looked at them. These familiar faces, these neighbors who had helped him bury his dead. "It's not natural," another man said. 4 people from one family, all the same disease. That's not just bad luck, George. That's something else. They talked about the old beliefs, the old stories. They talked about cases that had happened before in other New England towns, where families were being destroyed by consumption and desperate people had taken desperate measures. They talked about exhumation, about checking the bodies, about a ritual that came from the old country, from a time before modern science, when people dealt with the undead in more direct ways. George listened. Part of him wanted to throw them out, to tell them they were insane, that this was 1892 and people didn't do these things anymore. But another part of him, the part that was watching his last child die, that part was listening very carefully. "If one of them is..." The neighbor paused, searching for the right word. If one of them hasn't rested properly, if they're still affecting the living, there's a way to stop it, a way to save Edwin. George Brown looked toward the bedroom where his son lay coughing, dying. He thought about his wife's grave, his daughter's graves. He thought about the modern world with all its science and progress, and how none of it had saved anyone he loved. And he thought about the old way, the ritual, the chance, however small, that it might work. "Tell me," he said finally. "Tell me what needs to be done." When we hear the word vampire today, we picture a specific thing. We picture Count Dracula, elegant, aristocratic, with a black cape and prominent fangs. We picture a creature who is sophisticated and seductive, who lives in a Gothic castle and fears crucifixes and sunlight. We picture something from a horror movie or a romance novel. But that image of the vampire is a relatively modern invention, popularized by Bram Stoker's novel Dracula in 1897, 5 years after Mercy Brown died. The vampires that haunted New England were something different, something older and, in many ways, more terrifying. The New England vampire was not a stranger. It was not a foreign count or a mysterious visitor. It was your mother, your sister, your child. The belief worked like this. When someone died of consumption, they didn't always rest quietly in their grave. Sometimes, for reasons no one fully understood, they remained in a state between life and death. They were not conscious, not alive in any meaningful sense, but they were also not completely dead. And from their grave, they would feed, not on the blood of strangers, but on the life force of their own family members. They would drain the vitality from their living relatives, passing the consumption from the grave to the living world. This is why the disease seemed to move through families sequentially. The first to die was the vampire, and they were slowly killing everyone else. The signs of a vampire were specific. If you exhumed the body and found that it had not decayed normally, if the skin was still intact, if there was liquid blood in the heart, if the body had shifted position in the coffin, these were proof that the corpse was undead. And there was only one cure. You had to stop the vampire from feeding. You had to destroy the organ that held the unnatural life. You had to cut out the heart, burn it to ashes, and feed those ashes to the sick family member. This would break the connection between the undead and the living. It would free the dying person from the vampire's grasp. This was not a Christian ritual. This was something older, something pagan, something that had survived in folk memory, even as people converted to Christianity and accepted modern science. It was a ritual from the deep past, from a time when the line between life and death seemed thinner, when people lived closer to nature and to mystery. And in the isolated communities of New England, where old beliefs died hard, this ritual was still being practiced in the late 1800s. Mercy Brown was not the first. She wasn't even close. Between the 1790s and the 1890s, there were dozens of documented cases of vampire exhumations in New England. Dozens that we know about, recorded in newspapers or mentioned in letters or remembered in family histories. And probably many more that were never written down, that happened quietly in small communities and were never reported to the outside world. Let me tell you about some of them. In 1793, in Manchester, Vermont, Captain Isaac Burton's wife died of consumption. Then his 2 children got sick. Desperate to save them, Burton exhumed his wife's body, cut out her heart and liver, and burned them. The children died anyway. In 1799, in Exeter, Rhode Island, the same town where Mercy Brown would be exhumed 93 years later, a farmer named Stukely Tillinghast watched consumption kill his family one by one. In desperation, he exhumed his daughter Sarah, found liquid blood in her heart, and burned it. 14 members of his family died of consumption in total. In 1817, in Woodstock, Vermont, Frederick Ransom's father died of consumption. Then, Frederick got sick. His friends exhumed the father's body, burned the heart, and Frederick drank the ashes. He recovered, though whether because of the ritual or despite it, we'll never know. In 1854, in Jewett City, Connecticut, Henry and Lucy Ray's 2 sons died of consumption. When a 3rd son got sick, they exhumed the boys and performed the ritual. The surviving son lived. Case after case after case, families destroyed by consumption, desperate people turning to a ritual that was already ancient when America was founded. This was not rare. This was not isolated. This was a regional phenomenon, a vampire panic that lasted for over a century across all of New England. And it included educated people. Doctors participated in some of these exhumations. Ministers blessed them. Town officials sanctioned them. These were not just illiterate farmers acting on ignorant superstition. These were people who read newspapers, who voted, who participated in modern society. But when their children were dying and medicine had no answers, they reached for something older than medicine. They reached for ritual, for folklore, for any chance, no matter how slim, of stopping the disease that was destroying everything they loved. Here is what the people of 1892 didn't know. They didn't know that tuberculosis was caused by bacteria. Germ theory was just beginning to be accepted in the medical community, but it hadn't reached most of rural America yet. The bacteria that caused TB wouldn't be identified until later in the 1890s. They didn't know that tuberculosis spread through the air when infected people coughed or breathed near healthy people. They didn't know that living in close quarters with a TB patient meant you were almost certainly being exposed to the bacteria every single day. They didn't know that some people's immune systems could fight off the infection while others couldn't, which is why some family members got sick and others didn't. They didn't know that the seemingly random pattern of the disease, the way it would skip one person and take another, the way it would advance quickly in some people and slowly in others, was determined by factors like the strength of the initial exposure, the health of the person's immune system, and pure chance. They didn't know that a body buried in winter, in frozen ground, would decay much more slowly than a body buried in summer. They didn't know that liquid blood in a heart 2 months after death was completely normal. That blood doesn't always clot or dry immediately, especially in cold conditions. They didn't know that rigor mortis can cause a body to shift position as muscles relax. They didn't know that the buildup of gases during decomposition can cause a corpse to move or make sounds. In other words, every single sign of vampirism that people looked for had a perfectly rational, scientific explanation. But they didn't have that science yet. The knowledge that would have saved them from this horror was still years away from being common understanding. And so, when they opened Mercy Brown's coffin and saw that her body hadn't decayed, when they saw liquid blood in her heart, they interpreted it through the only lens they had, the ancient belief in the undead. They were not stupid. They were not even particularly superstitious by the standards of their time. They simply didn't know what we know now. They were trying to understand the world with incomplete information, and they reached for the explanations that were available to them. There is something important we need to understand about George Brown and the other people who participated in these rituals. They didn't do this out of hatred. They didn't do it out of cruelty. They did it out of love. Think about George Brown. He had loved his wife, Mary Eliza. When she died, he mourned her deeply. He had loved his daughter, Mary Olive. He had loved Mercy. These were not people he hated or feared. These were the most important people in his world, and now he was told that one of them, even in death, was harming Edwin. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but because they were trapped in some unnatural state between life and death, and their undead body was feeding on the living. If you believed that, truly believed it, then the ritual was not desecration. It was mercy. It was freeing your loved one from a terrible curse. It was cutting the chain that bound the dead to the living, releasing both from suffering. George Brown agreed to the exhumation, not because he wanted to violate his family's graves. He agreed because he loved them, because he was willing to do anything, even something horrifying, if it meant saving his last remaining child. This is what desperation looks like. This is what love looks like when science has failed and hope is running out. We can judge the action. We can look back from our time with our knowledge and see how terribly wrong they were. But we should be very careful about judging the people themselves, because desperate love makes us all capable of terrible things. And so, on the morning of March 17th, 1892, George Brown gave his permission. The neighbors gathered. Dr. Metcalf, the physician, agreed to be present to examine the bodies professionally. The men with shovels arrived at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. George must have stood there in the cold, watching them work, and felt like he was splitting into two people. One part of him was a modern man, horrified by what he was allowing to happen. The other part was an ancient human, a father watching his children die, willing to try anything, to save the one who was left. The first two graves revealed nothing alarming. His wife and his eldest daughter had decayed naturally. They were at rest. But when they opened Mercy's grave, when they lifted the lid of her coffin and saw her body still intact after 2 months in the frozen ground, when they cut open her chest and found liquid blood in her heart, George Brown must have felt a terrible, complicated rush of emotions. Horror that this was really happening. Grief that his daughter's body was being violated this way. And hope. Terrible, desperate hope. Because if Mercy was the vampire, then the ritual could save Edwin. Then his son might live. Then all of this, all the horror, all the violation, all the awful things they were about to do, it would all be worth it. The fire was built. Mercy's heart and liver were placed on the rock. And as the smoke rose into the March sky, carrying the ashes of his daughter's organs, George Brown allowed himself to believe, this will work. Edwin will live. This nightmare will finally be over. He was wrong. Dr. Harold Metcalf was a trained physician. He had studied medicine, understood anatomy and physiology as well as anyone in 1892 could. He was not an ignorant man or a superstitious man. He was a professional, a man of science, and yet he participated in the exhumation of Mercy Brown. More than that, he supervised it. He examined the bodies. He confirmed the evidence of vampirism. He gave the ritual medical legitimacy. How do we explain this? Perhaps Dr. Metcalf believed in the vampire folklore, despite his medical training. Perhaps he had seen enough cases of consumption running through families that he thought there might be something to the old beliefs. Or perhaps, and this is more likely, he simply didn't want to stand in the way of desperate people trying to save a dying young man. He knew Edwin Brown was going to die. Medicine had nothing to offer. If the family wanted to try the old ritual, if it gave them hope, if it made them feel like they were doing something instead of just helplessly waiting for death, well, what was the harm? Dr. Metcalf didn't stop the exhumation. He didn't argue against it. He was there, in the cemetery, watching as they dug up 3 graves, watching as they opened 3 coffins, watching as they cut out Mercy Brown's heart. His presence lent authority to the proceedings. It said, "This is not just superstitious nonsense. This is legitimate. A doctor is here, examining the evidence, confirming what we're seeing." In the newspaper accounts that would soon follow, Dr. Metcalf's participation would be mentioned prominently. Even the doctor agreed that something was wrong with the body, the articles would say. Even the man of science saw the signs of the undead. But what Dr. Metcalf actually thought, what he actually believed as he stood in that frozen cemetery, that he took to his grave. The ritual, once begun, moved with terrible efficiency. Mercy's heart and liver were removed from her body. In some accounts, it was Dr. Metcalf who performed this grim surgery. In others, it was one of the townsmen. Either way, the organs were extracted, wet and red, still containing the liquid blood that everyone agreed was unnatural. A large flat rock, right there in the cemetery, became an altar. The men built a fire on top of it, not a small fire, but a roaring blaze, because the organs needed to be completely reduced to ash. Nothing could remain. Think about what this scene must have looked like. A crowd of 30 or 40 people, standing in a cemetery on a cold March morning. A fire burning on a rock, smoke rising into the grey sky. And on that fire, the heart and liver of a 19-year-old girl who had died 2 months earlier, burning, blackening, turning to ash. Some of the women in the crowd were crying. This was Mercy Brown, a girl they had known, a girl who had sung in the choir, who had smiled and laughed and been a part of their community. And now they were burning her organs like she was some kind of monster. But they believed it was necessary. They believed they were saving Edwin. The fire burned for a long time. Hearts and livers are dense, wet organs. They don't burn easily. But the men kept the fire going, kept feeding it, until finally there was nothing left but grey ash and small fragments of charred tissue. They collected the ashes carefully, reverently even. These ashes were medicine now. These ashes were the cure. They mixed the ashes with water, creating a thin, grey mixture that looked like dirty dishwater, and they carried it back to the Brown farmhouse, where Edwin was waiting. Edwin Brown was 24 years old. He had been sick for a long time, had traveled all the way to Colorado trying to get better, had come home for his sister's funeral, only to find himself too weak to leave again. He was dying. Everyone knew it. He knew it. Every breath was an effort. Every cough brought up blood. He was so thin that his bones showed clearly through his skin. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull. He looked like a skeleton that was still, somehow, alive. When his father and the neighbors came to his room with the mixture of ash and water, did Edwin know what it was? Did they tell him, "This is your sister Mercy's heart, burned to ash, and if you drink it, you might be saved"? We don't know. The accounts don't say. Maybe they just told him it was medicine. Maybe they were honest. Maybe Edwin was too far gone to really understand what was happening. But he drank it. He drank the ashes of his sister's heart. And then, everyone waited. The ritual was done. The vampire had been destroyed. The connection between the dead and the living had been severed. Edwin Brown should have recovered. He didn't. Days passed. Edwin didn't get better. He got worse. The cough continued. The blood continued. His body continued to waste away. George Brown watched his son dying and realized, with a horror that must have been overwhelming, that it hadn't worked. The ritual had failed. He had allowed his daughter's body to be exhumed and desecrated. He had allowed her organs to be burned. He had made his dying son drink his sister's ashes. And it was all for nothing. On May 2nd, 1892, less than 2 months after the exhumation, Edwin Brown died. He was buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, next to his mother, next to his sisters. George Brown had lost everyone. His wife, all 3 of his children. His entire family was gone, and he was alone. And the terrible knowledge he had to live with was this. Not only had he failed to save them, but in his desperation, he had violated Mercy's grave. He had allowed her body to be cut open, her organs to be burned, her remains to be treated like something monstrous, instead of like the beloved daughter she was. The ritual had promised salvation. It had delivered only more grief. If the story had ended there, with a failed ritual, a grieving father, and a small community keeping its secrets, Mercy Brown might have been forgotten, just another person lost to the White Plague. But the story didn't end there. Somehow, and we're not entirely sure how, word of what had happened in Exeter reached a newspaper reporter. Some accounts say that Dr. Metcalf mentioned it to someone, and the story spread. Others say that people in Exeter, horrified by what had happened, wrote to newspapers to report it. However it happened, within days of the exhumation, newspapers across New England were covering the story. The Providence Journal broke the story first, on March 21st, 1892, just 4 days after the exhumation. The article was sensational, shocking. Exhumed the bodies, testing a horrible superstition in Rhode Island. From there, the story spread like wildfire. Papers in Boston picked it up, then New York, then newspapers across the country, and even internationally. The London Daily Telegraph ran a story about the barbaric ritual happening in supposedly modern America. The tone of the coverage was almost universally condemnatory. Journalists expressed shock and horror that such a thing could happen in 1892 in an educated Christian community. They called it superstition, barbarism, a throwback to the Dark Ages. They mocked Rhode Island, mocked New England, mocked the people of Exeter for believing in vampires. It is difficult to believe that such ignorance and superstition exists in New England in the last decade of the 19th century, one editorial proclaimed. The people of Exeter were humiliated. What they had done in desperate privacy was now public spectacle, a source of mockery and shame. George Brown, who had already lost everything, now had to endure being called ignorant and superstitious in newspapers across the world. The publicity surrounding Mercy Brown's exhumation had an unexpected effect. It killed the practice. The vampire exhumations that had been happening across New England for over a century came to an abrupt end. After the Mercy Brown case became national news, no one wanted to be the next community mocked in the papers. No one wanted to be labeled as backwards or superstitious. The old belief didn't disappear overnight. People still whispered about it. Some still believed. But the public rituals stopped. Mercy Brown was the last documented vampire exhumation in New England. In a strange way, her violated body became the sacrifice that ended a century of grave desecration. The publicity was so intense, the mockery so severe, that it finally overpowered the old fear. Modern medicine was advancing. Within a few years, germ theory would be widely accepted. Within a decade, X-rays would allow doctors to see the damage tuberculosis caused inside the lungs. Within a few more decades, antibiotics would finally provide a cure. The age of the New England vampire was over. Science had won, though it came too late for Mercy Brown and the hundreds of others who had suffered the same fate. George Brown lived for another 10 years after losing his entire family. He continued to farm his land alone. He never remarried. He rarely spoke about what had happened. In 1902, he died and was buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery with his wife and children. The Brown family plot is there still. 5 graves in a row: Mary Eliza, George, Mary Olive, Mercy, and Edwin. An entire family wiped out by tuberculosis and fear. But while the others rest in obscurity, Mercy's grave has become something else entirely. Something her family could never have anticipated. It has become one of the most visited graves in New England, a destination for tourists and vampire enthusiasts, a place of legend. And this raises an uncomfortable question. In death, has Mercy Brown finally been allowed to rest? Or has she become trapped in a different kind of horror? The horror of being remembered not for who she was, but for what happened to her body. If you drive to Exeter, Rhode Island today, and it's a pretty drive, through rural countryside that hasn't changed much since the 1890s, you'll find Chestnut Hill Cemetery on a small hill overlooking the town. It's a typical New England cemetery, old, peaceful, with weathered headstones dating back to the 1700s. Trees provide shade in the summer. In the fall, leaves cover the graves in layers of red and gold. In winter, snow makes everything quiet and still. The Brown family plot is easy to find, even though there are no signs pointing to it. Because Mercy Brown's grave is the only one in the cemetery that looks different. Her headstone is simple, modest, with her name and dates carved into the stone. Mercy L., daughter of George T. and Mary E. Brown, died January the 17th, 1892. A.E. 19 years. But around the grave, there are always things, objects left by visitors, coins mostly, pennies and quarters scattered on top of the headstone and around its base. Sometimes flowers, often black roses, sometimes handwritten notes tucked under stones or into the cracks of the gravestone. Rest in peace, Mercy. You deserved better. I'm sorry for what they did to you. Some visitors come out of genuine sympathy and sadness. They come to pay their respects to a young woman who suffered twice, once from disease and once from fear. They come because her story moved them, because they think about what it must have been like to be 19 and dying, and then to have your body violated after death. But others come for different reasons. They come because Mercy Brown is famous, because she's the last American vampire, because her story is spooky, thrilling, a real-life horror story that happened in this very spot. Ghost tour companies include her grave in their itineraries. Paranormal investigators come with their equipment, hoping to capture evidence of haunting. Vampire enthusiasts make pilgrimages, treating her grave like a shrine. And some visitors, unfortunately, vandalize. They take pieces of her headstone as souvenirs. They scratch their names into the stone. They steal offerings left by other visitors. The cemetery has had to repair and even replace Mercy's gravestone multiple times because of damage caused by fans. This is Mercy Brown's legacy. She is remembered, yes, but she is remembered as a legend, as a story, as entertainment, not as the real person she was. 5 years after Mercy Brown was exhumed, in 1897, an Irish author named Bram Stoker published a novel that would change horror literature forever, Dracula. The novel tells the story of Count Dracula, a vampire from Transylvania who travels to England and begins preying on innocent victims. It's a Gothic masterpiece filled with themes of disease, sexuality, foreign invasion, and the clash between ancient superstition and modern science. And some scholars believe that Bram Stoker was inspired, at least in part, by the Mercy Brown case. We know that Stoker was a voracious reader who collected newspaper clippings about strange events and crimes. The Mercy Brown exhumation was covered not just in American newspapers, but in British papers as well, including the London Daily Telegraph. Stoker lived in London. He almost certainly would have encountered the story. And there are parallels between the Mercy Brown case and Dracula that are hard to ignore. In the novel, Lucy Westenra dies of a mysterious wasting illness that drains her vitality. After her death, she begins to prey on others, spreading the disease. The heroes exhume her body, find that it looks too fresh and has blood in the mouth, and destroy her by driving a stake through her heart and cutting off her head. The similarity to the vampire exhumations in New England is striking. The wasting disease, the belief that the dead are feeding on the living, the exhumation to check for signs of vampirism, the ritual destruction of the corpse to save the living. Did Bram Stoker read about Mercy Brown in 1892 and file the idea away in his mind, letting it simmer for years until it emerged, transformed, in his novel? We can't know for certain. Stoker never explicitly mentioned the Mercy Brown case as an inspiration, but the timing is suggestive, and the themes are resonant. Dracula is, among other things, a novel about tuberculosis, about wasting diseases that spread through intimate contact, about the fear of contagion, of bodies that should be dead but aren't, of old beliefs surviving into the modern age. Whether or not Stoker was directly inspired by Mercy Brown, both stories are connected by the same thread, the ancient primal fear of the dead not staying dead, and the desperate things we do when we're trying to save the people we love from death. Today, Mercy Brown's story has been told in dozens of books, articles, documentaries, and television shows. She appears in vampire encyclopedias and New England ghost story collections. She's been featured on ghost hunting shows and dark tourism websites, and almost every retelling focuses on the same elements: the exhumation, the burning heart, the vampire label, the sensational, spooky aspects that make for a good story. But what gets lost in these retellings is the real person. Mercy Brown was not a vampire. She was a teenager who died of tuberculosis. She sang in her church choir. She helped her father on the farm. She probably had friends, hobbies, dreams for her future. She loved her family, and they loved her. And then she got sick and died, and her body was mutilated by people who were trying to save her brother. This is not a fun ghost story. This is a tragedy. But the way Mercy's story is told today often strips away the humanity and focuses only on the horror. She becomes a character, a legend, a thing instead of a person. The merchandise and the tourism and the ghost stories turn her suffering into entertainment. And we have to ask ourselves, is this appropriate? Is this respectful? When we visit her grave to take selfies, when we tell her story around a campfire to scare our friends, when we buy t-shirts with her face on them, are we honoring her memory or are we exploiting her tragedy? There's no easy answer. History is always a negotiation between remembering and exploiting, between education and entertainment. But Mercy Brown deserves better than to be reduced to New England's last vampire. She deserves to be remembered as a human being who suffered and died, who was loved and mourned, who was violated after death by people who should have protected her. There is one piece of good news in this story, one way in which Mercy Brown's death was not entirely meaningless. Tuberculosis, the disease that killed her and millions of others, has been largely defeated in the developed world. In 1943, about 50 years after Mercy died, antibiotics were discovered. Streptomycin, the first drug that could kill the tuberculosis bacteria, was developed. Suddenly, a disease that had been a death sentence for all of human history became curable. Today, if you develop tuberculosis in America or Europe, you can be treated with a combination of antibiotics. The treatment takes several months, and it's not pleasant, but it works. The cure rate is over 95%. Tuberculosis still exists, of course. It's still a major killer in developing countries where access to antibiotics is limited. It's estimated that TB kills about 1.5 million people per year worldwide. But in places with modern medicine, it's rare, and when it does occur, it can be treated. If Mercy Brown had been born 100 years later, she would have lived. Her mother would have lived. Her sister would have lived. Her brother would have lived. A simple course of antibiotics would have saved them all. The science that people in 1892 were desperately waiting for finally arrived. It came too late for Mercy, but it saved countless lives since. In a way, every person alive today who has been successfully treated for tuberculosis owes a debt to people like Mercy Brown. Their suffering, their deaths, and the desperate, wrong-headed attempts to save them, all of that motivated scientists to search for a cure. All of that is part of the long, painful process of medical progress. Mercy Brown's death was tragic and senseless, but it happened in a time when people were doing their best with the knowledge they had. And eventually, that knowledge grew. Eventually, science caught up. George Brown lived with what he had done for the last 10 years of his life. We don't know what he thought about during those years. He left no diary, no letters, no confession. But imagine carrying that weight. Imagine knowing that you allowed your daughter's body to be cut open and burned. Imagine knowing that it didn't work, that your son died anyway. Imagine knowing that the whole world read about it in newspapers, that people mocked you and called you ignorant and superstitious. Imagine knowing that you violated your daughter's grave and it was all for nothing. George Brown must have asked himself 1,000 times, did I do the right thing? Was there any chance it could have worked? Or was I just a fool, a desperate old man who listened to superstition instead of accepting the inevitable? We can't answer those questions for him, but we can understand the impossible position he was in. He was a father watching his children die. Medical science had failed him, and someone offered him hope, even if that hope came wrapped in folklore and grave desecration. Did he do the right thing? Number Not by our standards, not with our knowledge, but did he do the understandable thing? Did he do what many of us might do in the same desperate circumstances? Maybe. It's easy to judge from a distance, from a time when we have antibiotics and x-rays and a deep understanding of infectious disease. It's much harder to judge a man who was living in a nightmare, watching his family disappear one by one, reaching for any solution, no matter how desperate, that might save the last person he loved. George Brown was not a villain. He was a victim of disease, of ignorance, of the limitations of his time, and he paid for his desperate choice with a decade of guilt and grief before death finally released him. The question we're left with is this: how should we remember Mercy Brown? Should we remember her as the last American vampire, a spooky legend for ghost tours and paranormal shows? Should we focus on the exhumation, the burning heart, the sensational aspects that make for entertaining stories? Or should we remember her as Mercy Lena Brown, a 19-year-old girl who loved to sing, who died of tuberculosis, who was the victim of both disease and the fear it inspired? Should her grave be a tourist attraction, or should it be a place of quiet mourning, a memorial to all the people who died of tuberculosis before we finally found a cure? These are not easy questions, but they're important ones, because the way we remember the past shapes how we understand the present. And Mercy Brown deserves to be remembered with dignity, with respect, with an understanding of the full human tragedy of her short life. What do you think? How should we remember her? The story of Mercy Brown is not really about vampires. It never was. It's a story about tuberculosis, the greatest killer in human history, a disease that destroyed entire families and left communities in mourning. It's a story about the limits of medical knowledge, about what happens when people are suffering and dying and science has no answers to give them. It's a story about fear, the ancient primal fear that the dead might not stay dead, that disease might have a supernatural cause, that the people we love might somehow be harming us, even from beyond the grave. It's a story about desperation, about the terrible choices people make when they're trying to save their children, when every rational option has failed and only the irrational remains. It's a story about a father who lost everything, who made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. And most of all, it's a story about a young woman named Mercy Lena Brown, who died too soon, who suffered twice, once in life and once in death, and who deserves to be remembered as more than just a legend. Mercy was 19 when she died. She had a family who loved her. She had a voice that people said was beautiful. She had a life, however brief, and it mattered. The disease took that life. Fear and ignorance took her dignity after death. But we can give her something now, over a century later. We can give her the truth. We can strip away the legend and remember the real person underneath. There were no vampires in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. There was only tuberculosis and fear and love twisted into something dark by desperation. And there was Mercy Brown, a victim of her time, who deserves our compassion more than our fascination. If you've learned something from this story, if you think it's important to remember these forgotten chapters of American history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who loves history or who thinks they know everything about vampires but has never heard of Mercy Brown. And if you ever visit Exeter, Rhode Island, if you ever stand at Mercy's grave, leave something kind, a flower, a note, a quiet moment of respect. Remember that beneath that weathered stone lies a real person who deserved better than what she got, both in life and in death. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. May Mercy Brown finally, truly rest in peace.